Who should pay for stopping the sewage? The obesity epidemic costing billions. And is space really the final frontier? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative peer Stuart Jackson, Labour peer Jenny Chapman, presenter of Politico's Westminster Insider podcast Alva Ray, and author and foreign affairs analyst Tim Marshall. Today,
we're sorry about the upset and the anger from the fact that there have been overspills of untreated sewage onto beaches and into rivers over the past few years. We're sorry that we didn't act sooner, but we get it.
But are bill payers going to foot the bill to fix it?
I remain committed to that goal. I want to bring down the levels of legal migration.
But with predictions net migration could have risen to as much as 1 million, what should the number be? Chef and restaurateur Thomasina Myers joins us to talk about tackling the obesity crisis that's costing the NHS dear.
One path is we stay on Earth forever. And then there will be some eventual extinction event. The alternative is to become a spacefaring civilization and a multi-planet species.
Ignition, 2, 1.
And do human beings need an exit strategy? Let's start today's programme with the headline in The Times. Water firm's £10 billion plan to prevent sewage spills. You heard there in the headlines an apology from the head of Water UK, the industry body. They say they understand the concern and the upset of the public, but a pledge of £10 billion of investment will probably result in higher bills. So is an apology, Stuart, that comes with a £10 billion price tag really an apology?
No, I don't think it is. And I've always believed that you need to have a tougher sanction regime with these companies. I think that many of them have significant foreign ownership, so there is a disconnect between the level of service they deliver to the bill payer in the UK and their objective, which is shareholder value. And I think there should have been a much tougher regime, like they have in the United States with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to actually hit these companies where it hurts. Right, I mean, the Environment Agency had suggested at one point that water company bosses should be jailed for serious pollution. Would you go that far? I think it should be considered because, you know, what this does, it completely undermines the whole ethos of privatisation, which generally has been good in terms of bringing significant capital into the industry. But they can't get away with this behaviour for very much longer. What do you think, Jenny? Is that £10 billion promise of investment really going to cost us?
Well, I think this has been going on for years and people are just fed up. Our rivers are dying and people are seeing it now with their own eyes. So what we need is mandatory testing, we need automatic fines, and we need to make sure that the people who are running the companies are held accountable. That hasn't been happening. And
but it is actually a legal requirement already, I think. Most of those things, real-time data on sewage spills.
Joe.
No, so
it's not. So you know, you need a government that's active and interested and is going to enforce what's been going wrong. Because at the moment, it has been a bit of a free-for-all with people who use these rivers every day, reporting problems, not having their voices heard, and then eventually something might get done, and there may be a fine, which frankly, you know, is a tip of the iceberg for some of these companies. And people are fed up. They're seeing the salaries of the bosses. They're seeing the dividends to shareholders. So they should be the ones who pay? Yes, they're seeing the dividends to shareholders, and they're wondering why they, as bill payers, are going to have to foot the bill.
I mean, last year, water and sewage companies paid £1.4 billion in dividends to their shareholders, and that was up from £540 million the previous year. Who should pay for the investment, Alba?
Well, I definitely don't think it should be bill payers. I think that's really clear. I mean, this is disgusting. It's a really disgusting story on sort of every level. Literally, I hate that we have to talk about it. Horrible that people will have to pay. I don't really understand why this apology has come today. I haven't heard an explanation for that when this has been such a big point of controversy for months and months. But I also actually think, I mean, as you know, I spend my days hanging around Parliament speaking to MPs. I also think this is not just a problem for water companies, but it's a really big political problem for the Conservatives. I mean, speaking privately to Tory MPs, they do know that there's a bit of confusion as to whether, as to where the blame lies. How much is it with water companies? How much is it on the government addressing it? But it's sort of come to be seen as this problem for a lot of, come to be seen by a lot of people as sort of the sort of representation of Tory Britain falling apart. That you can't get a GP appointment, you can't go for a swim without there being sewage around you. And I think it doesn't just come back to the water companies. It's about a government needing to tackle it.
Tim?
If a major electric company, senior management were told repeatedly that there were huge amounts of live wires lying around their network and did nothing, and someone stood on one and died, it would be logical to bring a criminal prosecution against them. I think we need that sort of logic with the water companies, because this stuff actually does kill people. So I agree with Stuart that you would need to very carefully look at making it criminal, very carefully. But I think if these bosses realised that they are knowingly poisoning people and doing nothing, there could be a legal case to answer.
Yeah, well, that's the evidence, isn't it, anecdotally, now that people are actually getting stomach bugs and infections and so on and so forth. Let's talk about immigration. Headline in The Sun: Rishi's gone squishy. Rishi Sunak backtracks on Tory pledge to get net migration below 250,000. It was the Conservative Party pledge in their 2019 manifesto to lower net migration. You can see here Boris Johnson, then, of course, Prime Minister. There will be fewer lower-skilled migrants and overall numbers will come down. Now, at the time, net migration stood at around 226,000, giving an effective target to hit during this Parliament. But let's see what's actually happened to those figures. You can see UK net migration, it drops, understandably, during the pandemic there in 2020, but hit a record of over 500,000 for the year to last June. Now, the Office for National Statistics are going to publish updated figures next week, but some analysts have already predicted that the figure could exceed 700,000, possibly going up to 1 million. Anyway, Rishi Sunak, who is in Japan on his way to the G7 summit, surrounded there by journalists, was asked about the pledge and whether he stood by it. And he said, "I've inherited some numbers. I want to bring the numbers down." But he refused 3 times to explicitly recommit to reducing legal migration into the UK to that level. Stuart, is it right to drop the pledge to reduce immigration to pre-2019 levels?
No, I don't think it is, and I think it's reneging on a firm manifesto commitment. I mean, my worry is that next week's figures will be an ERM moment for the Tory party, potentially.
Exchange rate mechanism.
Yeah. In what happened in 1992, where people actually gave up on the Tory party thereafter. And I do think that if you're seen to not take seriously this issue, there's a problem. I mean, there's a distinct difference between people who are social liberals, globalist type thinking people who think that actually effectively uncontrolled migration is a great thing, and there are other people saying, look, people are genuinely concerned, not racist, not xenophobic, but they're genuinely concerned about the impact on public services, housing, for instance. And at the moment, the Tory party is fighting itself, and I just think it's wrong politically and in terms of the faith and trust that people have in politics to renege on that solemn pledge that was made.
I mean, that's quite interesting from Stuart, if he thinks it's equal to a moment like the exchange rate mechanism coming out of it in the early 1990s. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, fascinating to hear in terms of the Tory party dynamics on it. But I think the reality is Rishi Sunak does kind of need to move away from this pledge because he's not going to meet it. I mean, when when you look at the numbers, when you sort of break down these numbers, I think actually the Prime Minister is right to say that the more important issue for voters on this and the way that they gauge how much of this is a problem is actually illegal migration or sort of people arriving in the UK without prior approval. I think that is the vote mover. I mean, you can even see it sort of just when you look at the polling on this and how much it's an issue, the line just peaks up to like a vertical line every time there's a small boat crossing in the news. So I actually think that Rishi Sunak is right to say that that's the thing he needs to be focusing on politically, including for Stuart, rather than this issue. And also even I mean, how would you get it down when you break it down? I mean, we've seen there's political consensus around this. A lot of these people are Ukrainians. A lot of them are Hong Kongers. Big political consensus that both of those groups should be coming here. A lot of them are students, so kind of, in theory, staying for more than a year, but likely to go home afterwards.
And work visas.
And then to plug labour shortages and actually, you know, I mean, we talk a lot about on this show the crisis in the care system. With some of these people coming in are there to plug that problem. I don't know where Rishi Sunak could bring that number down for you, basically.
Well, business has been addicted to cheap foreign labour for a long time, and they keep coming back to government saying, well, just one more tweak, please. I mean, just one statistic. I think I might say there's about 85,000 young people in this country apply for medical school places. We've capped it at 7,500. We give huge amounts of resources, universities, for obvious reasons, for financial incentive, to foreign students. It doesn't seem to people that things are very joined up. And I hate to say that as a Conservative, but people are frustrated about it. But I do agree with you, there is consensus on Ukraine and Hong Kong, but there isn't consensus, for instance, on family members of students, exchange students, those kind of things. And the government could take more action on that.
Tim?
The vast majority of people, I think, overwhelmingly want the boat stopped for a number of different reasons.
What the government deems
and they need to
illegal.
separate that out, but then also explain why we actually do need a degree of migration because of the workforce. And I think that most of the general public would be quite happy with that. The problem is getting the right educated people in and stopping that. Well, the first is relatively easy, and the second is incredibly hard, and he's going to fail on that. I don't know whether it's an ERM moment, but I know for sure it's a slow burn. You're doing nothing, you're doing nothing, you're still doing nothing.
But is it better to let go of the pledge rather than just miss it continually?
Well, I'm sure Mr. Starmer might mention that.
Jenny?
Every half hour once it happens.
I mean, do you accept that the numbers at the moment are high, but there are reasons? We've just heard some of them from Alva and from Stuart in terms of the points-based system, in terms of people coming on those schemes from Ukraine and Hong Kong and students. I mean, what should the number be for net migration?
I mean, I think we're in danger of having quite a thoughtful conversation about immigration,
well,
which
go for it.
is probably a very good thing. We would say that, you know, one of the things that this exposes is the stupidity of making these sorts of promises at an election, knowing probably that they're very unlikely to be met, but thinking, let's do it anyway. That actually is not a very good strategy for a politician. So what we want to do, we think we agree there needs to be a points-based system. We think what people really want is some order and some control. They're not so interested in a figure, but what they want to know is that there is a system that's fair and that works.
Well, there is a system, of course, in place. I mean, I suppose Stuart, along your lines of being thoughtful, is saying he still thinks the overall number is too high. So, does Labour think that 700,000 possibly going to mean it would be too high for net migration?
What you need to have is a system which I think Stuart and Alva actually referred to, is where you join up the needs of our country and businesses here with the immigration system, because that hasn't been happening. And you know, if we have a promise to make to have 10,000 extra nurses trained a year and things like that, and we want to make sure that those opportunities are available to young people in this country, because we agree that sometimes businesses have been using the ability to import labour as a substitute for training and investing in their own workforce. And that's something that's not in the interests in the long run of the UK, never mind a sort of a hostile debate about immigration. We've got to look at strategically the needs of industry in our country.
Right, but I mean, some of those needs were addressed by Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, in his March budget, saying that 5 construction jobs, roofers, tilers, carpenters, plasterers and bricklayers, would be added to the shortage occupation list. Are you happy with that?
Well, yes, but it's just a sticking plaster approach.
Yeah.
It's, you know, there's a corollary to all these decisions, and it's that you embed welfare dependency. We've got over 5 million people on benefits that perhaps a significant number should work. I admit there's mental health issues as opposed to back pain, which used to be the preeminent issue. But just constantly robbing the third world and the second world of decent people who will work, that's fantastic for them, but it doesn't really solve the societal issues of getting British people into work. And I think that's wrong. And I agree broadly speaking, with Jenny on the need to get that balance right.
So on the tilers and the roofers and the construction industry, we've had a shortage of skills in this country, and yet we have this big need to build more houses. So how about we build more houses and we use that as an opportunity to train a new generation of construction workers in this country who are highly skilled, using the latest technologies, the latest tools and the latest techniques to build eco-friendly, net zero homes.
It seems to be easier said than done, though, doesn't it, Jenny?
How about trying a government where ministers actually speak to each other and have a shared plan and an agenda that they actually go on and deliver?
I mean, there is
try that.
I mean, there is a political divide, isn't there, in the cabinet at the moment? I mean, it's very clear. You listen to the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who's been tasked, it seems, with, yes, tackling what the government calls illegal migration, those small boat crossings, and bringing down the overall numbers of legal migration. Meanwhile, the Chancellor, rightly or wrongly, is filling these shortages, and I think there are going to be more people. The scheme's going to be extended on seasonal fruit pickers, workers, etc. I mean, who's going to win this argument? I mean, one might argue there's a leadership contest already underway, but...
Yeah, I find it strange, actually, because I think that I don't know for certain, but I actually think that probably the main way in which people feel personally affected by this is asylum seekers in their constituency being housed in hotels. The people who feel very strongly about this are in that kind of bracket, and that's driven by Suella Braverman. Like, who can fix that? Suella Braverman. Why is that such a big problem? Suella Braverman and the Home Office. I don't think that it's legal migration and just the number going up and down that's really driving this in the same way. And also, all of these specific changes that are being made by the Chancellor, by the Education Secretary, are driven by a need in different parts of the Tory party. This week it's been on farming. I mean, it's the farming industry that has been saying we need workers from abroad to come and fill these gaps. It's Tory MPs advocating for that on behalf of their constituents. I don't think Suella Braverman is going to win that argument. Maybe it's for other reasons that she's putting up such a fight.
Well, I mean, Tim, there is polling evidence to support, I think, what you were saying earlier, implying that actually since Brexit, immigration matters less to some people, generally coming third or fourth on the list of the most important issues facing the country, probably because of cost of living at the moment. But there are pressures on public services too.
There are huge. There's also, and it's not discussed enough, there's an element of the sense of fairness. There is, it goes deep in all human cultures, all human societies, this sense of fairness. And when people see people being put up in hotels, and I'm not suggesting they are, living the life of luxury, but you will never persuade large swathes of our population that, hang on a minute, John, I used to went to school with, is on the street here. They're in a B&B with two of their kids, and we're paying to put these people in hotels. You will never win that argument. So it does need to be separated out. The migration policy we need for the economy, and I go back to City and Guilds, or whatever you want to call it. It was Mr. Miliband who said about 10 years ago he wants to see a point where every single child goes to university. That's nuts. I want to see a time when you get this massive choice and there's all these trades, craft, skilled people, train up the British workforce because the money's good and the work is good.
Well, that may be the driver.
Definitely good now.
What, in terms of the salary in the
absolutely.
or an electrician.
Technical and vocational education, we've got to put more money. Both parties understand that. To rebalance the economy away from, just focusing on university.
But the Tories have got this thing about they've got a very strange approach to education, because on the one hand, Stuart will say that, and you will hear a lot of Tories say that, but on the other hand, they've done some terrible things to BTEC and to 16 to 19 education, and they've not actually done anything that would make this situation any better. And I keep coming back to this issue about you have an agreement on what the problems are that face the country, but actually the ability to implement and to overcome some of those political divides within the cabinet, because they're what's really holding it back. And Rishi Sunak just doesn't seem to be able to bring those characters together to deliver.
Well, one of the other issues, I suppose, to put into the mix is the fact that the number of people not working in the UK due to long-term sickness has risen to a new record. More than 2.5 million are not working due to health problems, and one of them them is this, in this headline, the Daily Telegraph: massive cost of obesity to the NHS is revealed. And it says the heaviest patients require spending of £1,400 a year, twice the total for those of a healthy weight. And it is one of the biggest challenges for the UK economy, is reducing demand on the health system and increasing economic productivity. Let's talk to Thomasina Myers, cook, writer, television presenter and co-founder of the Oaxaca chain of Mexican street food restaurants. Welcome to you. Thomasina, why are people getting bigger?
Well, it's not about people. We haven't suddenly got greedier and lazier. That's not what's happened. What's happened is our whole food culture has changed and the food system has changed around us. So today, 57% of our food basket is ultra-processed. Now, there are increasing studies showing that this particular type of foods are really bad for us. They're leading to diabetes, dementia, cancers, and that is what's causing this long-term sickness and breaking the NHS. And it is interesting that the government, in two of its policy focuses, is on fixing NHS and fixing the economy, and that is all wrapped up in the food system. And I think we have to start looking at this piece, this ultra-processed food piece, as being commerciogenic. Like, unless there's conflicts of interest are limited, and we stop marketing and having such a proliferation of them around, then we aren't going to fix anything.
Right, so you want the government to specifically tackle that issue of processed foods?
Well, they have to, because even the food companies, I mean, they're making vast amounts of profits off the back of these foods, but they can't do it alone without legislation and rules. Not, if one company stands against it, then their shareholders will kick them out. So we have to have government to focus on it, and there has to be a limit to the conflicts of interest. And then things like those crafts, like get food education back in schools, use procurement in hospitals and prisons and schools to get better food through. And let's just feed the whole nation better, delicious tasting food.
Thomasina, I've got a couple of politicians in the studio, Conservative and Labour. Stuart, listening to that, specifically on tackling the scourge of processed foods and what it's doing to people, it's not about them being greedy and lazy.
I think the strange thing is we've never had so much information about how to eat healthily and have a proper diet across all media. So there must be something else. And I too tend to agree with Thomasina. I voted for the sugar tax, I think, in 2015 when I was in the House of Commons. And I think there is something for government to get involved. This scourge of ultra-high processed foods, we need to look at it because there is a causal link between that and increasing obesity. And education is important, but if we need to use the tax system, I think we need to do that as well, because we can't just sit back. The average person is paying £3,000 in tax every year for the NHS. And the balance between people working and paying tax and those needing the NHS is shifting, and it's an unsustainable system. So obesity is probably the #1 issue in the NHS.
Jenny?
I pretty much agree, to be honest with you. I think that the government's got a leadership role here. I think we've got companies, a food industry that's very, very good at getting people to make choices that we all know are not in our long-term best interest.
Right,
and
so
actually,
what would you do? If Labour win next year, what would you do?
I would be getting in those food companies and saying, work with us, because it's in no one's interest that people are dying younger. We also need to do, we also have a responsibility around children and prevention. I shudder when I hear things about giving jabs to teenagers to make them lose weight.
Yeah, well,
surely there is a moment much earlier around sport in schools, around eating in schools, around skills and education, and helping people have a healthy relationship with food before they even get to that situation.
Thomasina, you're worried about advertising, aren't you, particularly to children?
Well, children get over 500 advertisements on junk food to their phones and through tech every day. And that was one of the key legislations that the government were going to bring in, and then they've U-turned on it. And that's got to be crucial.
Absolutely right.
I mean, what do you say about, the Conservative government did, Boris Johnson promised to bring in, I think it was a ban, wasn't it, on those sorts of adverts before the watershed, and it got delayed and it still hasn't happened.
Well, we've had battles over chocolate oranges at the checkout and other battles. I'm not an ultra-libertarian. I don't think people should have a right to hurt their own health and particularly their children, their families. I do think there is definitely, I have to agree, I violently agree with Jenny Chapman here, that we can't just go straight to legislation. We do need to give the opportunity to the food companies to change for the good of the country.
But you have something like Kit Kat breakfast cereal, which they're defending, saying, but it's not aimed at children. I mean, come on.
Thomas,
no one believes that.
Thomas, nutritious. The Kit Kat cereal is allowed to be called nutritious. I mean, how is that allowed? 500 adverts of junk food to kids every day on their smartphones.
Right.
How is that sensible?
Right. Well, how is it allowed to? I mean, how are food companies? Will they really toe the line, even with politicians wagging their finger?
Not in the end. Well, if they don't, then we will have to legislate because this is costing.
And parents and guardians have a role.
Of course they do. I mean, as a parent, you do have to watch what your kids eat. But at the end, if that doesn't work, a government must be prepared to intervene because it's costing all of us, not just with our health, but we're paying for it as well. And I just think people are getting a bit wiser to it, and they are prepared for a government now to be more active in this area than they perhaps were a few years ago.
Thomasina, do you think there will need to be legislation in the end?
Well, companies, sadly, cannot act alone because if one company acts, their competitors will overrun them. So we've absolutely seen that hasn't worked. And when school food is failing in most schools, when it's failing in hospitals, it's failing in social care and in prisons, we have got to get a government that's more joined up and has a holistic approach because it feeds into climate change too. These type of foods, 57% of our diets made up of these foods, are really bad for the planet, for biodiversity, for climate. It's all linked, and until the government really takes that on board, I mean, something like the FSA, the Food Standards Agency, if that was given an independent power, like the Independent Climate Committee, then it could really get some teeth and tackle this. That's what needs to happen.
Alva?
Well, I think I basically agree with everything that's been said. I feel like maybe just the other missing part of the puzzle is people's working conditions and how much time they actually have to cook. I mean, I think it'd be all well and good certain things being legislated against, things becoming more expensive. But if you're, a mum working 3 jobs and you don't have much time, it is probably much easier to buy a ready meal than to cook a meal from scratch. And I suppose that I'm not proposing a solution on that, but I think that looking at where this can fit into people's lives rather than just looking at it from a top-down approach is probably quite important too.
I mean, obese patients, as we've discussed, are costing the NHS twice as much as other patients. But, I mean, how far should the state go, Tim, in terms of forcing people to lose weight?
It's a real tension, isn't it, between a nanny state and a culture that looks after its own. And what the food companies are taking advantage of is tens of thousands of years of evolution. We were hunter-gathering. When you come across something with loads and loads of sugar, you'd ram as much of it in your mouth as you possibly could to store it up. And that gives you a lot of pleasure. Now, you fast forward to only about 20 years ago, and then suddenly in comes this explosion of processed food, which makes us feel temporarily quite good. And we are ramming it in constantly, not just as we come across it every now and again. And they have taken advantage of that. And as for time, we've known about this for at least a decade.
It has been slow, hasn't it?
So reluctantly, I would fall down on the side of legislation.
You would?
Reluctantly.
I mean, a new law has been passed in New York outlawing discrimination based on weight. Fat shaming is increasingly unacceptable. But I suppose if obesity becomes the norm in the UK, it's going to be harder to tackle it.
I don't want to make things cost more for people that can't afford things.
No.
But cigarettes, nobody has a problem with legislating about that. The laws about the certain amount of things you can put in, which is difficult politically because who the hell are you to tell us what we can eat?
The other thing is we are also addicted to cheap food, and it's very sensitive politically to put people's food prices up, and the supermarkets and the manufacturers know this.
Right. I mean, Thomasina, a final word to you on the issue of food, because people argue it's very expensive to get fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, and there's that time issue that we've just talked about. Do you accept that that is a potential problem for people?
Fresh food, of course, is expensive, but when you see that the food we're eating is costing the economy £74 billion a year and it's breaking the NHS, what are the alternatives?
Thomasina Myers, thank you very much for talking to us today. We're going to move on and we're going to talk about space. Just have a listen to this.
History is going to bifurcate along 2 directions. One path is we stay on Earth forever, and then there will be some eventual extinction event. I don't have an immediate doomsday prophecy, but eventually history suggests there will be some doomsday event. The alternative is to become a spacefaring civilization and a multi-planet species, which I hope you would agree that is the right way to go.
Do you agree with that? I mean, just to say, you've just written the latest book in your series about the future of geography. This is How Power and Politics in Space Will Change Our World. Is Elon Musk right?
Yes, but at a much longer time frame than he was working on, which was 2050 and 1 million people on Mars. That will not happen. We're going back to the moon in 2026. The Americans have said they will land a man and a woman on the moon in 2026 through the Artemis Accords, which the UK is part of. But we're not going there for that reason. We're going there for commercial and military reasons. That's the new space race, commerce and military. But there is also that incredibly human thing about wanting to know what is at the top of that mountain. And now that we know what is on the top of all the mountains we've got a new mountain, the final frontier. And you asked the question at the beginning of the programme, is it the final frontier? The answer to that is yes, unless you can tell me what happens at the end of the universe. So
I can't,
yes,
actually.
exactly.
I can't tell you. I leave that with the big question mark. But, I mean, the sort of philosophical question that Elon Musk raises, Jenny, is do we need to go and seek civilisation elsewhere before we face extinction? Or do you think we should perhaps concentrate on what's going on here?
I am very much in the concentrate on what's going on here camp. I'm fascinated by what Tim has to say, though, and I really do look forward to reading his book. But I think we've got so many issues confronting people here at the moment. We've just been talking about people not being able to feed themselves properly, and that's where my focus is. But I do, having said that, I think there's a big opportunity here for the UK to be involved with this. It's exciting. These are great jobs for people. There's some great science is going to come from all of this, and we should be there involved in the middle of it. I believe that Liz Truss, in her short time as Prime Minister, managed to get rid of the National Space Council as one of the decisions.
I was going to say went to space, but I must have missed that, yeah.
She was a bit out there. But let's not let that stop us. Let's get ourselves at the forefront of this. We're good at this stuff.
Yeah.
We've got great universities, and we should be, there leading the way.
Yeah, do you agree? I mean, is this something that sparks your curiosity?
Yeah, I don't think it's a mutually exclusive idea to sort out what's happening on Earth. But, if you look at Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Columbus, that humanity's always striven for knowledge and experience of another world. And I think this is just another much more technologically based version of that.
Well, can we do both at the same sort of pace? I mean, Alba, this is the headline in BBC News. Global warming set to break key 1.5 Celsius limit for the first time. Indicates perhaps we should be focusing more here before we go out there.
Yeah, I agree with Jenny that I think this book sounds fascinating, but I always feel a bit uncomfortable when we talk about sort of space stories or like these massive sums of money when we've been speaking, I don't know, a few breaths before about much smaller issues that affect people's lives so much more. I mean, I'm all for taking a step back and looking at things globally. But when you do that, I think you can just see that sort of as a human race, we're so bad at sorting out our problems together. I think it's something like we make 3 times as much food for the global population than we need, and yet half the population is starving. We haven't sorted out problems like that. We're not sorting out climate change. And then when we take a step back, it's sort of in a quite Western way, thinking like, oh, well, let's find another planet to live on.
When I was 15 in 1980,
a little while ago,
a huge, I think something like 15% of the global, 40% of the global population lived under $1 a day. It's now less than 9%. So progress through science is happening, and space exploration, I think, is a quantum leap further. And obviously, I was also brought up watching Star Trek, so I think...
Weren't we all?
It's going to be a fantastic, exciting adventure.
I was more Doctor Who. But the question I've got for Tim about this, and I suppose you're going to say read the book, is how the politics of this all work, because the big players are China, Russia and America, and obviously relations ain't good here on Earth. So how is that going to play out?
It mirrors what's happening here.
Right.
There is the American-led bloc, which the UK is in. The Artemis Accords, 23 countries. There's the China with Russia as its junior partner, trying to pull in people like Iran into its space. Oh, thank you very much. and so all that stuff. But to take on the questions, and I'll try and be brief. Well, militarily, which we've partially discussed, you cannot fight a modern war without space assets. More than 80 countries are in space, and many of them are developing countries like Nigeria, which have their own satellites.
So it's busy.
Now.
It's busy.
Yes, there's going to be another 20,000 satellites launched this decade. But also, the very things we need for renewable energy are there on the moon. The lithium, the many of the metals that go into the giant wind turbines. Now, that will happen, I believe. We will mine the moon for those things, which is probably a good thing. And then also, a little further out, vast fields of solar panels can direct the sun's rays directly down to the Earth 24/7, because there's no night and day up there. So, I mean, the book essentially is about politics, but within it there are all these things about the potential benefits for humanity, as well as the competition that is taking place.
So how well positioned is the UK in all of that? I mean, listening to your description as it's mirroring what's going on here on Earth, I mean, the UK is still part of the European Space Agency after Brexit, but with a third country status, as I understand it, and that means it's lost access to the EU's Galileo sat-nav system and so on. Are we in a good position or are we not?
Those are two slightly separate things. The ESA is not the European Union.
No.
It is separate, but the European Union is a body within it, as well as the nation states. The UK is also in it as a nation state. Yes, we've been kicked out the security side of Galileo. The UK, and I think this might surprise people, has the third most satellites of any country. And that's a legacy of empire and concrete that we left behind, and the military bases that have to talk to each other. The UK is a second-tier power, along with countries like Japan in space, along with Japan, Israel, the UAE, France, Italy, Germany. They have their own space command. We have a spaceport in Cornwall, and they've just broken ground for one in Sutherland in Scotland.
Well, and Nigel, can I show you then that headline in the Telegraph? Japanese Space Agency to launch from Shetland in major boost to Britain. So are we going to see more of this?
Well, this may be part of that 18 billion that Sunak's just announced from Hiroshima. I don't know. But Cornwall, you launch from a plane. The ground that they've broken in Sutherland in Scotland is for direct launch. To put small satellites up. We make satellites, we're good, we've talked about our scientists. We are a second-tier space power and probably destined to remain that, but within this block, and I'm afraid we're going out in this new space race for commercial and military reasons, not as united humanity.
Right. I mean, do you think it is worth then investing a bit more time and energy in that?
Well, I suppose that would be my question to Tim. When you've been researching this, is there a trade-off? Maybe we have no option, but when you look at China's spending on space exploration as opposed to investment in its population, it's still, I mean, it's much better than it was, but, that's still, a very poor population in many ways. Is there a trade-off, or is that actually that you can do both and we shouldn't be seeing it in that way?
I think we have to do both. I don't think we have a choice. I accept that there are these problems on Earth, but space will help us solve some of them. One small example, the satellites now can tell a small farmer, let's say in Ghana, you have a field the size of a football pitch. If I was you, I would sow this crop in that half of it. That's very, very useful knowledge. It comes from the satellite.
But it's interesting on your question about a trade-off, because, I mean, rolling back to Cold War times, the spend on defence, the sort of peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, we could spend more on things like health and education, broadly speaking. Might that, we're looking again at spending more on defence, rightly or wrongly, because of the Ukraine war, and this may feed into that, if, as Tim's saying, it's important militarily as well as all the other reasons.
One thing that I'd like to ask, it's asked Tim.
It is.
It's about, is there a rules-based regime here, or if it isn't a rules-based regime, should there be one, and when is it likely?
It's a central part of the book, this. We do not have the rules of the road for the 21st century. They were written in '67, the Outer Space Treaty. Didn't have lasers then. They said, don't put weapons of mass destruction on your satellites. OK, I won't, but I might be able to arm them with lasers. There's no rules about how close one satellite can be to another. We need, very urgently, a brand new set of rules internationally agreed for that and for space debris.
And space debris, what are the consequences if we don't have some rules sort of written up?
I don't want to make you cry.
Don't. My makeup will run.
She can't
I can't. I have to hold it all together. But no, go on.
There is a potential danger of the satellites, which are absolutely integral to the world economy and to our critical infrastructure. They are in danger of space debris, and we need to have a global agreement to clear it up.
I mean, there are things like this sort of issue, satellite space, and AI, artificial intelligence.
And asteroid hits.
Yeah, but is government really able
that's
to
another
keep
one.
up?
He talked about an extinction event. An asteroid, massive one, is one, and that's why humanity spent X billion on DART 2 years ago, which went X 100 million miles, whatever it was, and managed to deflect an asteroid as a test, and it did it. That was money well spent.
Yeah. Jenny?
I mean, it's just fascinating, isn't it? I mean, just when you think that we've got a real struggle working out how to fund the NHS properly and our education system and keep people safe on our streets, we find that we also have to worry about asteroid hits and is there enough space for all the satellites that we need?
We'll save that for another time, solar flares, because go on, sorry, Jenny.
Well, the concern that I have is that, yes, there does need to be some sort of rules internationally agreed, but we seem to be doing a very bad job of agreeing rules.
We will go through 10 years of absolute competition in space and then might come together. It's the pattern we saw with nuclear warfare. It took years before they actually got round the table again.
So you need international leaders who have the foresight and the gravitas and the understanding and the diplomacy skills to be able to deliver that, and I worry that we don't.
Let me bring you all back down to earth. The Telegraph, sending F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine is up to White House, says Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary. I mean, Stuart, Rishi Sunak and the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, are going to rally sort of an international coalition, they say, because we don't have them. But Ben Wallace presumably is right. It's just not going to happen without the Americans, and they've said no so far.
Yes, so far. I feel duty-bound to say that without Ben Wallace and Boris Johnson, things might have turned out very, very differently. I mean, they were ahead of the curve last September and October before last in getting serious resources to the Ukrainians, and things could have turned out differently. But we can't do anything without probably Germany and definitely the United States in terms of F-16s. But we can't afford to let the Ukrainians lose this war either.
Right. So do you think Labour would be behind the idea of putting pressure on the Americans to roll in behind this?
That the Labour Party has backed what the government has done on Ukraine from day one. And, you know, we are mindful of the issues around escalation, of course we are, and this does need to be taken seriously. You can't just be gung-ho about it. You know, you do have to, everything has to be considered carefully. But what you're not going to see is the Labour Party trying to sort of throw rocks at the government over this. It's essential that we stick together. We are absolutely resolute in our position, which is clear about supporting Ukraine.
But there is a bit of a dilemma, isn't there? Putting pressure on the Americans because they are the ones, maybe with Germany, as Stuart was saying, to actually supply this. And on the other hand, escalation is a problem, Alva.
Yeah, but I think that what we've seen from the UK so far is a willingness to lean in and support Ukraine, and rather than to worry about escalation. And that's been the theme. Ben Wallace has really taken a leading role in that, and I think that is his view. And all he can do at this point is put pressure on the White House. But I think that's the calculation that the government continues to make. I
mean, Zelensky's been asking for a long time because he says that's what we need to outdo the Russian forces. Why are the Americans reluctant?
Well, there's two main things. I agree with Stuart. Britain has led the way, and also they said they wouldn't get NLAWs, they went. They said there wouldn't be tanks, they went. They said there wouldn't be some of the planes that have gone, and then the Storm Shadow has gone. More planes will go. F-16, there's two things going on here. It's not escalation that's the problem. The Russians, every time you send a bullet, they say, right, we're going to escalate. That's not the problem. The problem is it's essentially, potentially such a game changer, the F-16s, that they can, if they were to strike deep inside Russia, and if they were to precipitate Putin's downfall, there is a genuine danger that Russia falls apart. And the implications of that I can give you 20 different war scenarios around the periphery of Russia that could break out, whether it's Georgia, Kazakhstan, you name it. And the Americans are very concerned about that. So that's the one constraint.
I don't know if we've got time for the other
constraint.
The other is
quick. Tech. It's their air intake is incredible in F-16. It needs a pristine runway. They don't have that many pristine runways.
thank you to all of my guests today for an interesting programme. I will be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the iPlayer. But from all of us here, bye-bye.